Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through sources, pull out the key insights, and basically give you the shortcut to being genuinely informed. So today we're digging into something that, well, I think probably hits home for a lot of us. Picture this. You've really committed to a new spiritual practice. Maybe it's meditating every single day, or you're doing affirmations, maybe studying some deep philosophical texts, and you start to feel something shifting, right? A sense of progress, maybe an expansion. You might even feel a little bit, well, special, like you're really on the path. It feels good. But then maybe this quiet little question pops up. Is this actually growth, real transformation? And here's the kicker. Is this just the ego, being clever again, finding a new, maybe more shiny spiritual costume to wear? Today, that's exactly what we're diving into, this profound challenge to, well, modern spirituality, our guide. The brilliant, sometimes controversial, always provocative Tibetan Buddhist master Chögyam Trungpa. And we're looking particularly at his landmark book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. It's a pretty unflinching look at our spiritual motives.
Right. And our mission here really is to go beyond just defining spiritual materialism. We want to uncover the subtle ways, the ones you often don't even see, that your spiritual journey can kind of twist back on itself. How it becomes just another form of self-centeredness. We'll look at how spiritual ideas, practices, even compassion itself can get hijacked, turned into tools for this spiritual materialism, where the search for enlightenment ends up being just another thing to acquire, another notch on the ego's belt. We really need to understand not just what it is, but why it matters so much for your genuine growth, your authentic transformation. And we'll draw on a really rich mix of wisdom traditions to explore this.
Okay, let's unpack that right away, because Trungpa's core idea is pretty startling. He's basically saying the ego doesn't just, pack its bags and leave when we start meditating or chanting. Not at all. It gets creative. It adapts. It kind of co-opts our best spiritual efforts.
Exactly. It puts on a spiritual disguise. Maybe it's organic cotton robes this time, but underneath.
It's the same old ego, pulling the strings.
Pretty much. Still trying to maintain its sense of control, its feeling of importance. And what's fascinating and kind of insidious is how this works internally. A Course in Miracles talks about this dynamic. It highlights how the ego, in its relentless drive for autonomy, this deep need to feel separate and self-sufficient, actually blinds us. It blinds us to the truth of our unity. The Course says if you overlook love, which it sees as our fundamental nature, you're overlooking yourself. And if you deny that true loving self, well, you're bound to fear unreality, fear the void, because you've cut yourself off from what's real. The ego's goal of being totally separate, it can't actually be achieved because, the larger purpose, God's purpose, which includes ours, can't be defeated. So this pursuit of a self-centered goal, even a spiritually flavored one, which we often chase so hard, it ultimately brings fear, not happiness.
So it sounds like this striving for separateness, this me, myself, and I, even when we think we're being spiritual, that's the root problem, the ego spiritualizing its own agenda.
Precisely. And look, this isn't new. Theologia Germanica, that anonymous 14th century text, puts it so bluntly. The more of self and me, the more of sin and wickedness. The core idea there is that any will that's separate from the divine will, any purely self-serving drive, is a distortion. It talks about a false light within us. This part of us that imagines it's above nature, fancies itself God, takes on divine attributes, thinks it's beyond all rules and laws.
False light. That's a powerful term. How does that show up today? Because it doesn't sound just like old theology.
Oh, it's incredibly relevant. That false light is that little whisper, isn't it? The one that says, oh, I'm more enlightened than them, or I'm beyond those ordinary rules. You see it in the spiritual practitioner who maybe dismisses ethics because they think they've transcended good and evil.
Hey, using spiritual concepts to justify, well, maybe just being selfish.
Exactly. Claiming it's all divine will or it's part of my growth, even when it hurts others. That's not freedom. That's the ego building a fancier cage. It leads to what the text calls a false licentious freedom. Real spiritual freedom doesn't cut us off from our humanity or ethics. It deepens that connection. This false kind leads to carelessness, disregard. Ultimately, it bears what the text calls the fruits of the devil, which is just a stark way of saying the consequences of self-centered delusion.
I think we can all relate, though, to the pull of really intense spiritual experiences. A profound meditation, a moment of insight on a retreat, a big emotional release. They can feel amazing, truly transformative in that moment. But what happens, like Trungpa warns, when that feeling, the experience itself, becomes the main goal instead of just a byproduct? What happens when we get kind of addicted to the spiritual high?
Ram Dass's story in Be Here Now is such a vivid example of this exact trap. It's a real warning. He'd done it all right. Seen the Dalai Lama, sacred sites in India, yoga, meditation, even profound LSD experiences. And yet, he found himself, his words, extremely, extremely depressed. He felt addicted to the experience, but he couldn't make it last. He couldn't stay.
Mm.
He hit this point, I had done everything I thought I could do and nothing new had happened. It was turning out to be just another trip.
Mm.
This addiction to the experience, chasing the high rather than the deep, often quiet, lasting transformation it might point towards, that's classic spiritual materialism, because those highs are fleeting. And if you cling to them, you just end up suffering again, because the ego always wants the next fix.
And this suffering, this chasing highs, seems really tied into how our minds work, doesn't it? Our internal storytelling.
Absolutely. Look at the power of now. It says straight up,
Yeah.
the greater part of human pain is unnecessary. It is self-created as long as the unobserved mind runs your life.
Mm-hmm.
The pain doesn't come from what happens out there, it suggests, but from our internal resistance,
Yeah.
our non-acceptance of the present moment.
Okay.
And that resistance is directly linked to how much we identify with our mind, with the ego. The stronger the identification, the more we suffer. So it really makes you ask yourself, what are you really seeking? Genuine freedom from the ego's suffering? Or are you maybe just looking for a nicer, more spiritual version of the same old egoic existence? The difference is huge.
So underneath all these traps, it seems like the bedrock issue is this persistent feeling of separation, the sense of being an isolated I, separate from others, separate from truth, maybe even separate from our own deeper self. Like we're little islands, even when we're doing spiritual things about connection.
Right. And Conversations with God tackles this, calls it a divine dichotomy. It's a fascinating perspective. It suggests that for God the All, to know itself as the All, as pure oneness, it also needs to know itself as not the All, through individuation.
Okay, like needing contrast to see clearly.
Kind of. This divine desire for individual experience leads us, as sparks of that divine, to forget who you really are when we enter physical life. But the forgetting isn't a mistake. It's necessary. It allows us to choose to be who we are, to choose our divine nature, rather than just being told. So our job here isn't really to learn something new we already know deep down. It's to remember who you are.
Remember, like putting the pieces back together.
Exactly. And just as importantly, to help others remember too, spiritual materialism happens when we get stuck in the forgetting, when we start believing the illusion of separation is the final reality, and we use spiritual tools to build up that illusion instead of dismantling it.
That's a powerful way to put it, not learning, but remembering. And it connects right back to how we perceive things, how our thinking itself can reinforce the divide.
Absolutely. It lines up really well with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which critiques how logic, especially Western dualistic thought, just assumes this split between subject and object, observer and observed. The book basically says logic is not final wisdom. It suggests the illusion of separation isn't best tackled with more thinking, but by quieting down the mental activity, dissolving that dualistic framework.
So bringing this all together, what does it mean for you, the listener? It sounds like our basic perception of being a separate self, while maybe necessary for having unique experiences, can become the biggest spiritual roadblock if we buy into it completely. If we forget we're fundamentally connected, forget our source, we risk using spirituality just to prop up that very separation.
Right. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are. And that misunderstanding allows spiritual materialism to really take hold.
It's the mechanism that lets the ego wear those spiritual costumes we started with. We think we're doing spirituality, but we're operating from disconnection.
And that fundamental misunderstanding leads us straight into the next layer of traps, the subtle ways the ego disguises itself in practice.
Okay, so let's talk about practice. Many spiritual paths involve external stuff, right? Rituals, specific concepts, maybe even looking a certain way, clothes, diet, prayers, ceremonies. And these can be really helpful. They offer structure, tradition, community, but they can also become superficial if we're not careful. The outward form can become the whole point instead of just a tool for interchange, like polishing the frame instead of looking at the painting.
The Dhammapada, the Buddha's sayings, gives a timeless warning about this. It's pretty direct. It says, "Not by a shaven head is one a recluse. If one lacks due observance, speaks untruth. How can one possessed of longing and greed become a recluse?"
Wow, okay. So appearances mean nothing without the inner reality.
Exactly. The shaven head, the robes, the title, they don't make you spiritual if you're still driven by greed or delusion, if you're not living the principles. True reclusion, it suggests, isn't about the look. It's about the inner work of calming your own wrongs, big and small. It cuts right through spiritual pretense.
And sometimes these external things can become almost well, like a performance, can't they? I remember seeing someone once, very elaborate robes in a totally normal setting, speaking in this super hushed, wise voice,
Yeah.
but then they absolutely lost it when their fancy kombucha order was wrong. It's that kind of disconnect. Is that what the cloud of unknowing is getting at?
It absolutely is. That text talks about diverse, unseemly practices that follow them that be deceived in this false work. It lists things like outwardly staring as they were mad, or clipping when they should speak, or crying and whining in their throats.
So exaggerated, showy behaviors.
Exactly. The text suggests these often signal an inner distortion, someone maintaining an error through sheer presumption, maybe intellectual pride, rather than genuine spiritual progress. It is a performance. The ego loves an audience, and these external displays become its stage.
That's fascinating. What's driving that, do you think? If it's not real, what's the motivation behind those kinds of performances?
Well, when these practices are empty of real inner meaning, they become just another way for the ego to feel special, to feel advanced. They create this veneer of piety. You look spiritual, maybe you even convince yourself you are, but you haven't dealt with the underlying stuff, the desires, the fears, the ignorance.
So it's like collecting spiritual status symbols instead of doing the inner work.
Precisely. The ego wants validation. If it can't get it materially, it'll cleverly shift to getting it spiritually, building a new identity based on these external markers.
Now, shifting inward, it's totally natural to want comfort, right? Nobody actively seeks out discomfort. But what happens if our spiritual path becomes only about avoiding discomfort, about dodging hard truths about ourselves or the world? What if we're just looking for a kind of spiritual safety blanket instead of a mirror that shows us what's really there, warts and all?
Theologia Germanica again describes a really insidious aspect of that false light here. It's this delusion that convinces someone they've gone beyond Christ's life in the flesh, beyond ordinary suffering, that outward things can no longer touch them or cause pain.
A kind of detachment, but maybe a false one.
A very false one.
Yeah.
It leads to this belief that you're unmoved by good or evil, like God in eternity, and so you deserve special treatment, homage even. It's a massive trap. It fosters carelessness about virtue, a lack of real compassion. It leads right back to that false, licentious freedom. It's really an ego defender mechanism wearing spiritual clothes. It expertly dodges real engagement with suffering the world's and, crucially, one's own.
That sounds a lot like what people call spiritual bypassing, right? Using spiritual ideas to avoid dealing with real psychological or emotional stuff.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And Saint Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic, she also warned about this. She talked about the devil counterfeiting spiritual favors. She said you can spot the fakes because they don't produce peace and light. Instead, they bring restlessness, anxiety, inner turmoil.
Interesting. So the feeling is the clue.
Right. And she stressed being extra careful to avoid offending God, especially if you feel you have received divine favor. Because, she said, the devil, or we could say, the potential for self-deception, sets much more store by one soul in this state. The implication is, the further you think you've progressed, the more subtle and dangerous the ego's tricks become. You need even more vigilance.
So when we talk about this, it's not necessarily about a literal devil with horns, but more about understanding these internal dynamics, how our own hidden desires for comfort, for superiority, for avoiding pain can create these convincing counterfeits of real spiritual experience inside our own minds.
That's the key insight, I think. Without radical self-honesty and discernment, our inner world is fertile ground for these illusions. The ego uses spiritual language to keep its story going, offering what looks like peace, but is really just another detour from genuine change.
Okay, another big trap seems to be our love of understanding things. We like to analyze, categorize, feel like we've got a solid grasp on reality, put things in boxes. But does that work for spirituality?
Yeah.
Can we really grasp the infinite, achieve enlightenment just by thinking about it really hard or reading enough books?
Well, the untethered soul points out something crucial. Your consciousness is actually experiencing your mental model of reality, not reality itself. We're constantly filtering, narrating the world to ourselves, shaping the experience to fit our existing mental maps.
Creating a buffer.
Exactly. A buffer against raw, unfiltered reality. We build this intricate story about how things are, and then we mistake the story for the actual thing.
And this constant thinking, analyzing, categorizing, that can become a real spiritual obstacle, can it? It feels like it could lead to a kind of intellectual arrogance.
It absolutely can. Remember Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It critiques that desiccating, lifeless voice of dualistic reason, using Aristotle as an example. It suggests this relentless analysis, this eternal naming of things, can kill the creative, intuitive spirit. Applied to spirituality, you see people who can brilliantly dissect doctrines, debate philosophy, win all the arguments.
But they aren't actually living it. They haven't had the transformation themselves.
Precisely. They've mastered the map, but they've never set foot in the territory.
So the analysis seems to be, if we think we've mastered spirituality just with our intellect, because we've read everything and can explain it, we fall into that trap where the ego claims ownership of the knowledge. It gets puffed up, arrogant, feels superior to those who don't get it. It's not wisdom, it's a spiritual ego trip.
Exactly. And the Fifth Agreement puts this beautifully. It suggests humanity largely believes in lies because we're dreaming, living inside a shared mental construct, a consensus reality. Real skepticism, it says, isn't about being cynical. It's about recognizing this collective dream state and constantly questioning that voice of knowledge, the tyrant, the big judge, inside your own head.
Asking who's talking.
Right. Who's delivering the message? Is it the real you? Or is it just the ego's filtered interpretation trying to stay in control? That kind of critical self-inquiry is vital to cut through the illusion of intellectual mastery and actually move towards lived wisdom.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting and maybe a bit uncomfortable. When we mistake our mental map for the actual territory or our intellectual grasp for lived experience, we're basically building our spiritual house on sand, aren't we?
Totally shaky ground.
We keep reinforcing the ego's story that it's the one doing the understanding, the accumulating. It's like having this incredibly detailed map of Mount Everest, tracing all the routes with your finger and believing you've climbed it.
Without ever feeling the cold, the altitude, the actual effort, or seeing that incredible view for yourself.
Exactly. We collect concepts, build this sophisticated internal narrative of spiritual mastery, but it's all happening inside the ego's playground. It really makes you wonder, how many of us are just living in the map, convinced we know the mountain, without ever actually taking the climb?
So if spiritual materialism is all about the ego puffing itself up, collecting spiritual brownie points, the way out has to involve a pretty radical shift, doesn't it? Towards humility, towards real self-awareness.
Getting out of our own way, basically. Dissolving the ego's grip.
I think so. Look at St. John of the Cross. He talks about entering the dark night. Now, that phrase sounds bleak, but it's crucial for cutting through this stuff. He describes it as a phase where God, or maybe just the process itself, starts pulling souls from being beginners towards real contemplation.
So it's not just despair.
No, it's much more. It's a stripping away. Our usual spiritual comforts, the practices we rely on, our neat understanding, even those nice spiritual feelings we chase, they start to get challenged. They stop working. It's a time when the ego's usual tricks for feeling special or in control just fall flat, and it can feel confusing, even painful. But St. John says true progress isn't marked by big shows of virtue or smarts. It's marked by deep humility, a real desire to be taught by anyone who can on them profit. And being more willing to talk about your faults and sins than your virtues, it's the total opposite of the ego's PR campaign. It demands vulnerability.
That focus on deep self-knowledge and vulnerability over wanting external applause or being seen as a master feels key. It's an inside job, not a show.
Absolutely. And Thoreau in Walden echoes this, right? Encouraging us to be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, and not his father's or his mother's or his neighbor's instead. This quest for your authentic path, free from needing outside approval, is vital. Trusting your own inner compass, even if others don't get it yet.
Being truly who you are without the costumes.
That's it. The courage to do that.
So what does this kind of deep humility actually accomplish? It sounds like more than just being modest.
Well, this humility, this radical letting go, it's like taking your hands off the steering wheel, spiritually speaking.
Okay.
It allows us to stop the ego's desperate attempts to control the journey, to force enlightenment. St. John of the Cross says, in this state, God is passively working here in the soul, wherefore the soul can do nothing. The soul finds itself annihilated, not destroyed, but stripped of attachments, earthly and heavenly. And in that space, it gains real knowledge. Knowledge of its own smallness, but also of God's greatness. When personal desires quiet down, the understanding is free to grasp truth. This annihilation is really the dissolving of the false egoic self.
Which then reveals the real self.
Reveals the authentic self in its direct connection to the divine. It's a surrender that leads to true sight.
Let's talk about love. We usually think of it as an emotion, right? Something that comes and goes, often conditional. But what if it's something much bigger? What if it's the actual foundation of real spiritual awakening? A force that's inherently unconditional and cuts through all this materialism.
A Course in Miracles puts love right at the center, that core message. Teach only love, for that is what you are. It's powerful. It's saying love isn't something you get or become. It's your actual nature already. The Course uses symbols like the crucifixion and resurrection, not just as history, but as internal processes. The resurrection symbolizes sharing, collective awakening. It requires the reawakening of every son of God for the sonship to know its wholeness. And son of God there means all of us, every conscious being.
So a universal awakening.
Yes, for this collective sonship, this spiritual humanity, to realize its wholeness, every part needs to wake up to its true loving nature. And this is presented as knowledge, not something the ego grasps or achieves, because the Course says that communication link that God himself placed within you, joining your mind with his, cannot be broken.
An inherent connection.
An unbreakable bond. It's already there. The ego just convinces us it isn't, or that it needs to build a bridge.
So, okay, it's not about trying to become loving, but recognizing we are love. How does that actually look in practice, day to day? How does it move beyond just a nice idea?
Well, look at the Bhagavad Gita. It emphasizes transcendental loving service. A conscious person acts not for personal gain, not for the ego, but purely for the satisfaction of the divine. Through this, they become perfectly detached from sense gratification. The path shifts from self-centered activity to constant remembrance and meditation on the divine, expressing that inherent love through selfless action.
So channeling that love outwards through action.
Exactly. Making love the very basis of your being and doing, transcending the self.
That's a great connection, actively demonstrating the love, not just thinking about it.
Right. And the Philokalia, that collection from the Eastern Orthodox mystics, says, love alone harmoniously joins all created things with God and with each other. It describes someone who's truly acquired spiritual love as having an intellect that does not have thoughts unworthy of this love about anyone.
No judgment, no resentment.
None. They endure injuries calmly, patiently. It's this expansive love that purifies thought and action, extending everywhere without conditions. It dissolves the ego's boundaries.
This definitely goes way beyond the conditional love we usually experience. It feels much more universal, profoundly transformative, like a giving that actually fills you up.
It does. And you can think about Deepak Chopra's law of giving here, too. The more you give attention, compassion, kindness, the more you receive. Why? Because the intention should always be to create happiness for the giver and receiver. It suggests we're bundles of thought in a thinking universe, so our inner state ripples outwards. True giving isn't a loss for the ego, it's an expansion of the true self. It's the natural expression of our loving nature, and that inherently cuts through the self-centeredness of spiritual materialism.
Okay, so if the ego is always living in the future, planning, worrying, or stuck in the past, regrets, glories, and worker, then it makes sense that real freedom has to be right here, right now, in the present moment, escaping the ego's timeline.
Absolutely. The Untethered Soul gives great advice here. It says, it's not just about letting go of thoughts and emotions. It's actually about letting go of the pull that the energy itself has on your consciousness.
The pull. What does that mean exactly?
It's that magnetic quality. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, they arise, they grab your attention, they pull you in, they seem to be you. But the book points out these things come and go. Yet, the consciousness didn't go anywhere. It stays constant and simply watches all of it. Recognizing that difference between the transient content and the constant awareness is like night and day. That's the core of presence. Awareness is free from the things it's aware of.
The unchanging watcher behind it all.
Exactly. The ego thrives on identifying with the content. Consciousness is inherently free of that identification.
That state of just observing without getting caught up, without identifying, that sounds like egolessness itself.
Yeah.
Where the watcher is distinct from what's watched, revealing the nature of awareness.
It is. Sam Harris, in Waking Up, clarifies this really well. He says the sense of having a persistent and unified self must be an illusion. Why? Because it's built on constantly changing things, thoughts, feelings, sensations. But consciousness itself is free, no matter what arises to be noticed.
So meditation isn't about achieving some special state.
Not necessarily. He defines it as the practice of finding this freedom directly, by breaking one's identification with thought and allowing the continuum of experience, pleasant and unpleasant, to simply be as it is. It's about recognizing the freedom that's already inherent in awareness itself, before the ego constructs its narrative around it.
And crucially, this isn't about pushing away discomfort or pain, is it? It's more like opening up to it with awareness, without judgment, letting life just be.
Exactly. Pema Chodron talked about this beautifully in When Things Fall Apart. She says the discovery of egolessness often happens when all our usual schemes fall apart.
Mhm.
Hitting your limit, that raw edge, she suggests, can be a doorway to sanity and the unconditional goodness of humanity.
Mm. Finding sanity when things fall apart.
Right. And meditation, for her, is practicing not indulging or repressing, but just letting the energy just be there, making friends with your hopes and fears over and over. This quiet, steady observation creates a huge shift from ego-driven reactivity to a spacious, accepting presence. And in that presence, spiritual materialism just doesn't have fertile ground. There's no self there trying to acquire things or put on a performance.
So, wrapping this all up, what does it mean for you listening right now? It sounds like true spiritual practice is much less about getting new spiritual stuff, experiences, concepts, identities, levels, and much more about the really courageous act of letting go.
Letting go.
Letting go of the ego's constant need to grasp, to control, to define, to accumulate. It's about allowing yourself to simply be, to be present with the whole messy, beautiful reality of right now, free from the suffering that comes from believing all the mind's chatter and illusions.
It's really about discovering the boundless space of who you already are, underneath all the spiritual costumes and the materialistic urges.
Wow. Okay, so we've journeyed through this really subtle landscape of spiritual materialism with Chögyam Trungpa as our guide. We've seen the ego's disguises, how it cleverly takes over even our best intentions, turning spiritual seeking into just another form of getting. But we've also looked at the path through it, radical humility, that boundless unconditional love, and the sheer power of being present right now.
Yeah, seeing how figures like Trungpa, Ram Dass, St. John of the Cross, and others from totally different traditions, they all point towards this same core truth. That real spiritual progress often feels counterintuitive. It's not about adding, it's about surrendering, dissolving the false self, not decorating it.
Right. Which brings us to the final thought, the question for you, the listener.
Yeah, how do you see your own patterns of spiritual materialism playing out as you practice, as you grow?
Hmm.
Is it subtly puffing up your sense of being a special self, creating a spiritual identity, making you feel like you've arrived? Or is it genuinely, slowly dissolving the walls that separate you from wholeness, from real connection with everything?
The challenge isn't to stop seeking.
No, not at all, but to really look closely at how you seek and why you seek. Maybe, as these traditions suggest, the most radical spiritual act, the real cutting through, isn't about striving to become something more. Perhaps it's simply allowing yourself to be, letting life unfold in all its stillness and chaos without the ego constantly jumping in to interfere, to label, to acquire, to perform. So the code remains, what will you choose to let go of right now in this moment to truly be present with what is?